Hi, this is Howard Kraft. I am very honored to be the co-chair of the Leadership Forum community along with LaTanya Wilkins. And it's my pleasure to welcome all of you. I see a lot of familiar faces who've been attending the last 4 or 5 of these sessions. It really represents the very best of what the Leadership Forum is all about, and that's experiential learning. It's about networking. It's about driving towards meaningful change. And certainly in these days where there is so much going on in the world, social unrest and COVID-19 and all the challenges that we face, we certainly expect more of each other. We expect more of ourselves. And this community is all about trying to improve what we do individually, organizationally, and societally. So we're pleased to share the dialogue with you today. I'm going to turn it over to Katleho Mahono, who will introduce our guest facilitator for today.
Thank you very much, Howard. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon to everyone, depending on which part of the world you are in. It is such an honor and a privilege for me to be introducing our provocateur for today. Her name is Rachel Nyaradzo Adams, and she's known globally as a leadership and transformational specialist who helps organizations achieve peak performance through ontological coaching and training. Now, in a world where a lot of leadership development and leadership development pedagogy focuses on, external things like how to influence, how to motivate, how to communicate more effectively, it is clear, I guess, to anyone who's doing work in this space, that there is a deeper need for a focus on the being and not just the doing of leadership. And Rachel does phenomenal work to help leaders not just think about what they do, but who they are and where they are coming from in what they do. I've had the privilege of, knowing Rachel over the last 3 years. I actually first met her about this time 3 years ago, doing work for the Obama Foundation as part of the Obama Africa Leaders convening, and can remember like it was yesterday how her session specifically left everyone thinking more deeply about how they lead, why they lead, and how they show up as leaders. And so, I could go on to tell you all the great work she's done with McKinsey, Yale, Ellen Gray. But if there's one thing that stands out about Rachel is that she doesn't just do great leadership development work, but she embodies it. And it's really my privilege and my joy to be sharing, or to have her share her work with the Leadership Forum community. So without further ado, I will now hand you over to our provocateur for today, Ms. Rachel Adams.
Thank you so much, Katleho, for that very generous introduction. And thank you to the Leadership Forum community for having me. This is the first time I've presented here, so I'm really excited to be in this conversation about incubating leadership from a space of being. Before I continue, I'd just like to acknowledge my teachers, Julio Olalo, Alan Sela, Wendy Palmer, and Stacey Haynes, who've been very influential in my understanding what ontological leadership is about, what beingness is about. And so I'm looking forward to having the conversation with you. So let me start off by asking you 3 grounding questions. The first is, how do you tend to inhabit your body in leadership and also in other aspects of your world? So if you think about everything that's happened over the last few months, with COVID, with conversations around racial inequality, how have you found yourself to be in your body? Are you light and expecting? Are you heavy and contained? Do you find yourself with an energy that is restless? And why have you inhabited in that way? The second question is, what emotions do you tend to cultivate as you experience new realities or adjust to new realities? So for example, when the world shifts, do you find yourself in acceptance? Do you find yourself immediately really being in the moment with the way things are? Or do you find yourself in resentment, perhaps feeling like a victim of circumstances and feeling helpless within that? And why are those the emotions that you go to? And also, How have you cultivated that emotional ecosystem over time? Finally, what language do you tend to use as you navigate your world, to direct action in your world? So, do you think of language as passive? Do you think of it as just descriptive? Or do you think of language as being generative, that as you utter, you are actually being active in the world, in the way in which you use your words, in the way in which you use metaphors, in the way in which you put sentences together, right? How much power does language hold in your way of being? So these questions that I've asked are really questions that are central to ontological leadership. Ontology, if you look it up in the dictionary, is about being, right? It's exploration or the study of being. And in ontological coaching, what we're looking at is the acknowledgement that when you enter into a room and you're doing what you're doing as a leader, strategizing, problem solving, being creative with your team, dealing with shifts within the environment, before the doingness is occurring, there is a beingness that is arriving beforehand. And it is that beingness that is then the source of your actions in the world. And really, ontology is about what is possible for you in terms of action. So based on your biases, your emotions, the energy dispositions that you hold, the archetypes that you tend to go to as a leader, these things shape your perceptions and your attitudes, and therefore they cultivate or influence, rather, your ability to learn and change as you lead. And really, in ontology, what we're saying is that leadership is not about skill set. It is a lot more about what is your ability to learn and change as each situation presents itself, and what actions are available to you as a leader and which ones are not. Ontology is also about the awareness that we are continually co-creating the reality that we perceive and experience. And so often we don't see the world as it is, right? We see it as we are. And so that agency of co-creating the world in a specific way. And so when we speak about ontology, we're really talking about your habitus, or what we call your coherence. And I'll explain that a little bit later. But really, you've just heard me talk about the fact that certain actions are available to us because of our ontology, because of our beingness. And I go to Archilochus' famous quote, which I love, that we don't rise to the level of expectations as we're going through life. We actually, in fact, fall to the level of our training. And a fundamental leadership question with leaders is, where are we with our practice? Where are we when we are cultivating our leadership capability? And my belief is that leaders should be possibility creators. And so if we are limited in our coherence or in our habitus, that means the people around us who are following us and depending on us for leadership then are also limited in their own possibilities. And so there's really a call to expand our horizons, to expand our ways of being by experimenting with different archetypes, with different emotional ecosystems, and with different speech acts that then expand those possibilities. So let me just play with a question here, right? So this is a poll that Matthew will run for us. So without knowing the commitments or the mantras of the leadership archetypes that I've put here, which word or which of these archetypes resonates with you most intuitively, just by reading? So let's just hear what everybody says. Just give it a minute. So do you resonate with warrior energy, or the king and or the queen, or lover, or adventurer, or healer? And don't worry too much about what these mean. Just intuitively, what do you find yourself drawn to? Okay, if we have enough results, Matthew, can we show what those are? Okay, wow. Okay, adventurers. I don't often come across a lot of adventurer archetypes. That's very interesting. That's the largest group here. And then we have a number of healers, which is wonderful, especially for where the world is now. I think that even in our organization, there's a calling for healing energy and relearning the way in which we have constructed institution. You know, I love Frederick Laloux and his conversation on wholeness as a system of practice in organizations. We've got a few lovers, even fewer kings and queens, and then we've got warriors in the middle there. So that's very interesting. I think it's interesting even to think about how we play with that lover and king, queen archetype, and why it is that we tend to avoid some of these archetypes and why we are drawn to others. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. But let me just tell you a very brief story about a leader I worked with some years ago, and I share his story with his permission. I met this leader in Nigeria. He was the head of a startup, a pharma startup, and he came to me really struggling with getting his team to be innovative, to be creative, to speak up. And his initial focus was, you know, work with my team and help them shift and help them be better employees to me. But I started to explore with him the possibility of how, if he considered how he was being, could he see perhaps how he was limiting the results that he wanted to have in the environment? And really, Yemi, after some work, we found that he occupied the warrior archetype. And in fact, he occupied it in its shadow. The warrior archetype is about getting things done. It's about putting yourself aside and and focusing on the task that is at hand. In light, it is very productive, but in shadow, people who are warrior archetypes tend to become quite bullish, tend to burn out quite easily, and tend to exasperate people quite a lot, you know, when they're in shadow. And so what was happening with Yemi is that he was holding to this archetype so much without the versatility of accessing other archetypes that the outcomes that he was in fact trying to create in the world were not possible. And it turned out that this had a lot to do, again, habitus, the history. He had had an experience when he was 7 years old where he determined that the world was not safe. And so his mantra was really kill or get killed, watch your back, people are always trying to get you. And so because of that, he was always inhabiting this fighter spirit, if you will. And so really when we talk about ontology, we are saying that when we think of those three questions I asked, your body, your emotions, your language, which are really in many ways driven by your thoughts. I love John O'Donohue's what are the 7 thoughts that govern your life, right? Such a fundamental question, because those in many ways then help to cultivate the body that you're in. And I'll talk about why these 3 things, your emotions, your language. And we say it's those 3 things, or that coherence or predisposition, that drive your actions in the world and therefore generate your results. And if there's certain results that you're not yet experiencing, you may want to consider that there's a coherence that you have not yet cultivated. So if I use myself as an example too, I used to struggle with courageous conversations. I used to struggle with delegation and authority. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that I inhabited lover and healer much more than I did warrior and king or queen. And because of that, really didn't know sometimes how to express, for example, when I was angry. So I would hold this anger inside of me, and people would say in feedback, you know, you're very passive aggressive. And I'm like, oh, but I think I'm such a nice person. But it's because I was holding this energy that I didn't know how to move out of my system, because that coherence is something I had not yet cultivated. So when we try to create shifts only at the actions level, we say that's first order learning, that's knowledge. But when we start to ask ourselves, but what is the beingness that creates these actions in the world, that moves me towards particular action in the world, and it is almost like a magnet for me? We call that second order learning, which is where our wisdom lies, which is when we go beyond leadership just being about skill, but becoming about consciousness. So if you think of Yemi, and really that central aspect, if I go back, my apologies, we call that coherence or disposition, your observer. And this is what I was talking about earlier, that we then see the world as we are and not as it is, because we are co-creating reality. It isn't just happening to us. So if you think of Yemi, you know, he lived in this body of resolution, or the warrior body. His emotional disposition was generally angry. He had a lot of resentment about the world because of the very traumatic things he had experienced as a child. And, you know, when we say you're resentful, we mean that, you know, you show up, but you actually don't want to be there. So he was leading this team, but really he wasn't invested in their growth and their development. He was merely invested in his survival. But of course, we never say these things, right? But we live them out in our day-to-day actions. And his language was essentially very dictatorial, right? He always used I. It was always about what he needed. He very seldom asked people about what their needs were, where they were at in terms of the team dynamics. And so let's talk about just very quickly about why the body, the emotions, and language. Well, our bodies, because they are a unifying force, they're the energy that connects us to others. And often if we don't shift energy based on the experience that is presenting itself in the moment, we can find ourselves to be stuck. In terms of emotions, emotions are ultimate drivers towards actions, and emotions held over time become moods. And so every organization, every institution, every country has a mood, right? So we know right now, for example, the United States of America, based on what has happened with George Floyd and with the protests, there's a mood that is palpable in the country that I think has gone through a gamut of things, right? Whether it's deep upset or deep anger, that then perhaps shifts into possibility and expectation, that may then shift into ambition about how to shift the future and to change the future, etc. So emotions are important because they ultimately drive our actions. Then finally, language, because language is action. Language is very generative. And so if you think about the power of metaphors, Angela Merkel and Donald Trump have chosen to use the metaphors of a war, talking about COVID-19, right? That we're at war and there's an enemy and we're all soldiers on the front. Whereas Jacinda Ardern of New Zealand has used the metaphor of a marathon. We are going through a marathon. And so if you think about what are the different possibilities that are given by using that specific language, and I'm not saying either is good or bad, I have no judgment about it. In fact, all of these countries have had spaces where they've done well and spaces where they've struggled. But the question is, what do those metaphors create in the minds of people as they hear you? So let me just end by exploring. We're not going to explore emotions and language, but we'll look at bodies a little bit. And I'll ask you to think about where you tend to gravitate and why you tend to gravitate towards that body. And when we break away to talk about what body you think you could access a little bit more, we say in ontology that every body has a mantra, a commitment, a breath pattern, and an energy. Again, we won't talk about the breath patterns and the energy today because we won't have time to cover all that. But I'll just speak through the mantras of each one and ask you to think about which mantra do you think will really support us in the shifts that are happening in the world now, which mantra we don't visit enough, or which commitment we don't visit enough that we should be, and how we could start to access, because these archetypes, you know, as Carl Jung talked about, are really a part of our collective wisdom. They're a part of our collective beingness. And we tend to inhabit one or two much more comfortably, but we can access others. So when we talk about the warrior, I'll start with the warrior. This we say is the archetype of resolution. The mantra of this is not about me. And so I think this is some of the energy that we've seen in the protests, right? That we are doing this for the shift that we are demanding for a country. So it's not about us, it's about what the country is yearning for, is crying for, what justice is yearning for and is crying for. And so the commitment to that is getting things done. And so often here we put our bodies in danger. We can put ourselves in the line of fire because we recognize that it's about larger shifts. Though, of course, as I said, the shadow of this, if we live in this archetype too long, we can tend to become very angry. We can tend to be driven very much by, the kind of fire that can burn everything out, rage. And so we have to be careful that we don't become bullish and we don't become disconnected. The second archetype, which is the archetype of stability, the king or the queen. This is the archetype in which the mantra is everything will be okay. I am committed to be responsible and that my leadership makes things okay. So this is not an arrogance. This is a commitment to responsibility. The commitment of which is stability, order, clarity, and a setting and a maintaining of boundaries. So I often say, if you have people in your team who say we're not sure of what our role is, we're not sure of, you know, what we're supposed to be doing, what is the vision of the organization, which are questions we get a lot. I often challenge leaders to say, where are you with the stability or the king or the queen archetype? Of course, the shadow of this is that we can get into dictatorial behaviors where we get so comfortable with power and the seat of power that, you know, we're the only ones. This is a big problem we have on this continent, unfortunately. Lots of people in the shadow of stability in our political spaces. Openness, the lover, this is where we commit to doing things together. We commit to collaboration. We commit to vulnerability. I love the Latin root of the word vulnerability, vulnerus, the willingness to be wounded. And I think this is going to be a big part of the healing process after the warrior of what's happening now, is how do we forgive each other? How do we see each other? How do we expand our circles of trust so that we can be in relationship much more intimately? And so the commitment here is collaboration. The mantra is come, let's do it together. And of course, the shadow of this is that our borders become too porous and we are open to abuse and to manipulation. The fourth archetype is flexibility. And in this archetype, we are essentially adventurers. The mantra is why not, right? Let's not take ourselves so seriously. Let's be open to new ways of being. And essentially this moment of COVID is calling us to flexibility, right? Where a sense of anti-fragility. How do we be simultaneously conservative while also being aggressive about how we can change our organizations and change the future? But this requires that we let go of these other three archetypes, which tend to be very sort of decided in a specific way of being, and really experiment. And so the commitment is experimentation and failure. The shadow of this, of course, is that nothing gets done if we're always playing and being experimental and trying out everything. And finally, the archetype of the healer, whose commitment is to, whose mantra is, let me tend to it. Let me be with what is broken. Let me try to piece it together and make it a learning moment, make it a moment of transcendence for everybody who's experiencing the current energy. And the commitment to this is shift. The commitment to this is transformation. And so when we are in the healing space, we are tending to hurt and committing ourselves to wounds and to healing wounds. The shadow of this, of course, is that the healer may become the one who needs the healing because they take on so much of the energy of the hurt and the pain of others that they ultimately become the wounded. And so these are the 5 archetypes that we talk about when we speak about coherence. And so we say, if there's certain results you're not experiencing in your life, is there perhaps an archetype you haven't visited enough? An archetype that you're afraid to enter into, that you don't know how to cultivate, and that perhaps there is a shift in terms of what you commit to, right? In terms of what mantra is inspiring you on a day-to-day basis that then can shift the actions in the world, your actions in the world. So let me stop there, and I'm going to ask Matthew again to lead us in a breakaway session. And the question I would like for you to explore, 2 questions, and I spoke about them a little bit earlier, is which archetype have you been most drawn to? But I'll ask us this time to focus on during this time of crisis and shift. So I have found myself completely and totally in healing. I've been, through my work, supporting my clients in coaching, in mentorship, in helping them work through some of the anxiety of this moment, doing a lot of neuroscience coaching as well. But the second thing is, which would you like to access more to increase your leadership effectiveness? Which of these archetypes seems quite foreign to you, even as you hear me talk about it? Why is that, and how could you access it more and experiment with that? So Matthew, I'll hand it over to you, and then after that we'll come back and conclude.
Cool, thank you. I just posted the questions in the chat for those that may need a reminder, and I will be breaking us into breakout rooms for about 15 minutes. So that way, hopefully everyone has enough time to say their piece. And you'll get a 60-second countdown when we're about to come back. So sending everybody off now. Let you take it back away.
Yeah, thank you. So in the few minutes we have left, I'd just love to hear some of the things that came out of the conversations. Matthew, should we just do a chat or?
Yeah, chat is fine. Or if you do want to open it up and we kind of let people just say their piece very briefly, that could be fine as well. But chat is usually great for everyone to participate.
Yeah, and I can just read out some of the comments that come up. It was nice to see all the different conversations that were also happening while I was speaking earlier. That hopefully we can chat about tomorrow when we have the coffee chat. How does "this is not about me" drive the warrior concept? Yes, the warrior, if you imagine that the warrior is going into battle, so the archetype is really about sacrifice. It's really about going beyond one's own needs and one's personal wants to do something for the greater good. And so "this is not about me" becomes the mantra because it's about something larger. And as I said, the commitment is getting things done. So whether it is that, we are trying to push for justice, or we're trying to get a project to get to a deadline. Sometimes you say, a parent trying to save a child, all of that is warrior energy. I hope that explains it better. We talked about the events. Thanks, helpful. That's good. I was resistant to warrior, but it was my choice for more of. Got it. Yeah, I relate with that, Jane. We talked about the events that are driving people to access different archetypes than are usual for them. Absolutely. I think this moment is calling us all to experimentation, to some form of adventure, right? That will drive us into new and different archetypes than what we are used to. Latonya made a great comment, how individuals help others to be better, complementary. Absolutely. The power of teams is really about, can all of us be accessing these different archetypes at different times and to draw from their individual and collective wisdom. Like I said, the biggest insight was that awareness precedes choice. So when we know where we are able to engage, better engage. I absolutely love that. In fact, Otto Sharma has a beautiful quote where he says that the quality of the results in your organization are driven by the quality of your awareness, and that form follows consciousness. And so a lot of leadership work is about sharpening the quality of our awareness so that we can indeed engage much more effectively. I think it's hard to be king or queen and that everything will be okay. But in our group, people explained, I need to feel okay with myself. So exactly. So in fact, stability is about, I didn't say this earlier, stability is about comfort with power, comfort with being in relationship with the self and with the power the self holds. Then it radiates to others. So I work with a lot of leaders who struggle with power, who struggle to understand that they're actually being expected to lead from the front and not be a part of the mass, right? Because there are moments when it's okay to be a part of the mass, but there are moments we're required to step out and be in relationship with the power. Very defined emotional intelligence or cycles. Yeah, I think I'm understanding that to be maybe knowing how to weave through the different cycles of where you are at. And
You had an interesting question, Rachel. Do we all have one archetype that describes us best, or do we access different types for different situations?
So to the quote I gave earlier about falling to our level of training, I tend to find that people have archetypes they're comfortable with. So especially when we're in crisis moments, high stakes situations, people will tend to go to what they know. When life isn't as sort of demanding, people can find sort of greater fluidity. Like I said, we can all access these archetypes. but many of us are experts in one or two, right? So, you know, there are people I know who live king or queen. They are so comfortable within themselves and within their own ways of being, but will struggle with flexibility because they take themselves so seriously. And so to be light feels like a threat to what they know. So more questions come. Can you coach us, me keeping these archetypes in mind to consider when to reflect on them for changes ahead? Absolutely. I think that the point of self-awareness and coherence is to be in relationship with asking the question, is the way I'm being serving me? So if there's a specific pattern that I tend to go to, does it still serve me, and what shift is available to me? Like I said, and we don't have time to go into their breath patterns and energy centers that come with these that you can access, not just by the mantra and commitments, which are up here, but about shifting your way, the way your body is being in the world. So for example, in conflict moments, is softening your gaze is an access to lava. Looking into people's eyes is an access to lava, because it softens us. So let me stop there, because I'm sure there'll be lots of questions that we can go to tomorrow. But let me just end with just a reminder of the ABC, that in any moment of shift, the real power that's available to you is awareness. Take a breath and make a different choice, right? Awareness is about that sharpness of, this is what I tend to do, this is where I tend to go to, but I can shift that. Take a breath literally means take a deep breath, because we know that accessing the neocortex, the space of compassion and reasoning and problem solving, is about the quality of your breathing and is about creating social safety for yourself and others. But it also means just take a pause to ask yourself a different question. And because of that, we can then access a different choice. And I'll end with Rumi. Yesterday, I was clever. I wanted to change the world. Today, I'm wise. So I'm changing myself. So I'm inviting you and reminding you of the power that is available to create shifts in the world when we create changes within ourselves and access differently. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Rachel. That was an amazing discussion. Thank you. We had a really fantastic group discussion, and it was extremely insightful. So fantastic job. So I will close us out. I think that's what I'm doing. So thank you, Howard, for opening us up here today. I want to remind everybody that we have the coffee hour tomorrow at 11 o'clock Central Time, and we will be digging into many different concepts, including an extension. Hopefully, Rachel, you can join us and kind of form a group around this topic, because it sounds like there's still a lot of interest around it, including Robert, who wants personal coaching. So maybe he can come to the coffee hour and join your group. We will also continue doing a group around Black Lives Matter and the murder of George Floyd. That was such a big group last week. We still have strong interest, so we'll be bringing a group focused on that as well tomorrow. And you could also participate on Slack through Parade. So if you haven't joined our Slack community, we have that as well. And that's it. So I'll hand it back to you, Rachel, in case anyone has any questions, because we do have 9 minutes and it's precious time. So if anyone has any questions for Rachel, please ask them now. Or any more comments?
Rachel, my name is Robert Schott. There's an interesting phrase around warriors that it's not about me, and the webinar I'll lead next week. And don't take it out of the context, but I'm going to play on the theme. It's all about me. So that's going to be fun to banter it. I have a totally different angle and why. But just a plug, if anyone who does join next week, I just want you to think about the words you think of when your organization talks about total rewards. So that's all my, prerequisite, that you come in ready with that. You can invent them as we go, but we're going to do a little exercise to collect those words and see what it means.
Great. Very good.
Rachel?
Yeah.
Can you share maybe with the rest of the group where they can learn more about some of the things that you didn't have time to go over today? So is there resources that you can share that would help people?
Yes. There's a book by Richard Strozzi Heckler, who's one of the big teachers in this space. I think the book is called Leadership Doji. Alan Sela has a book, I think it's called Somatic Coaching. And so that is about really using the body as a site for learning. Online, Stacey Haynes has some really good material where she talks about, you know, what are our sites of conditioning? Where do we learn these ways of being, and how can we interrogate them so that we can shift them if they no longer serve us? Wendy Palmer, she has some good videos online as well, all on YouTube that you can find. So if you just Google ontological coaching, either on Amazon or just general Google, you'll be able to find books, but also you'll be able to find, there we go. Thank you, Katlego. Katlego is always on. There you go. So yes, so multiple resources that you can definitely find online.
Okay. And we do send out a follow-up either today or tomorrow morning. And if you have any suggestions for people, we could put those in there.
Sure.
We've sent that out with the recording of this session, so it would be good. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you so much, Anne. And somebody's asked, will you be emailing the presentation? Yes, right? I can send you the slides. And
yeah, we can put a link to the slides along with the recording so people can have access to both, if that's okay with you.
Yeah. Yeah, and I see a question from Joel that says, how can we keep being warriors of light? Which is a question I love. You know, some of the work that I do is around healing and healing wounds, whether it's wounds that we hold in our lineage, but wounds that we hold as a society and as a commitment. And I really believe in something that people consider very old-fashioned, and sometimes maybe people think is too old-fashioned for someone as young as I am, which is really the power of forgiveness, right? The power of allowing people to learn from their mistakes and not creating shame around mistakes. And I think we live in a world now, especially with social media, that is very, very quick to punish. And it worries me about how we're going to lose the possibility for learning and continual expanding if we continue to hurt each other in this way. So I think there's an invitation to, and you know, we often say acceptance comes along with forgiveness, and acceptance doesn't mean tolerating injustice. And that's very important to understand. Acceptance as an emotion or a mood is, acceptance isn't about tolerating bad behavior. It's about accepting that there are certain things that can pre-exist us that we don't necessarily have the power to change, but from this moment on, going forward, we can apply our agency to create the world that we really desire. And I think that forgiveness and unshaming is going to be a big part of that. So for me personally, that's just my, that's where I'm at with where conversations are at the moment. Yeah. So Joel says you're just an soul.
Rachel, just maybe, Rachel Katlego here, just one more question is like, I feel like awareness is a big part of this process. What are some practices that you could share that help with that awareness of state so that we are more aware as leaders?
Yes. Well, I mean, a general practice of awareness is to be still in your body. That's usually a good entrance into awareness practice, is to just see where you hold tension in your system, where your system feels quite liberated and open, where you feel quite closed. And so that's usually a good first exercise into really ontological understanding, because again, a lot of us tend to go to the head, but we don't use the heart and the gut as intelligent centers of information. So to be with that, but also generally, I think it's engaging. For me, awareness is also about engaging with tools that give you a better language for how you are being in the world. So very simple things that people take for granted, like personality typing. I find a lot of leaders make a lot of mistakes in their leadership just because they don't understand where they tend to come from as a bias and how that can trip them up and how that can also serve them. Awareness is also sharpening your value system. I always say, can you name your top 3 values at any point? Because if you can't, chances are you're living from unconscious values, and chances are you're spending resources and making decisions that don't really align with who you're trying to be in the world. Leadership theory usually says at the beginning of our leadership journey, we should spend about 70% of our time on leading self. This often doesn't happen. People are too busy. They don't have the tools. And so what I then find is when I'm working with leaders who are in their 40s and 50s and 60s, you're kind of playing catch up with all the work that hasn't been done. So I say to people, spend some hours in the week just committed to getting to know yourself better, your light, your shadow, your personality, your values, your ontological state. Do an audit of your life and what were your defining moments, because a lot of ontology sits in defining moments, in those moments where we made a decision about life and we've been living that decision again. But yeah, so that's what I would say, Katlego.
Indeed. Wow. Thank you so much once again, Rachel. Yeah, we've come to, I guess, the top of the hour at this moment, but the conversation does continue tomorrow during the coffee chat. And I guess starting already to get really excited, and Kathy spoke about on the 8th and the 9th is the culmination of this experience. So please do mark that date on your calendar, the 8th and the 9th of July. But once again, thank you so much, Rachel, for the insights. And I know we couldn't get into all the wisdom, but has already got us started to think about stuff, and looking forward to a continued conversation tomorrow. And once again, thank you everyone for joining us today.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.